Okay, this is the Unit 4B solving level 3A. So in the first part here, we're just solving each equation by taking the square root. So if I have k squared equals 16, I'm going to take the square root of k squared so that the square is canceled and I'm just left with k. And that's going to equal the square root of 16. Well, the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. It has to be plus or minus because if I square positive 4 or square negative 4, both of which equal 16. And number 3, I have the square root of n squared is equal to the square root of negative 6. Well, I can't take the square root of negative 6. So instead, I have to rewrite this as the square root of 6 times the square root of negative 1. And if we remember in class, this means that n is going to equal the square root of 6i, because I is negative 1. Okay, moving down to the bottom part, I have x squared plus 6 equals 106. Well, it says solve each equation by taking square roots. Remember to isolate, meaning get the x squared by itself. So we have to isolate the x squared or the variable squared. So in our case, we have x squared plus 6 equals 106. So I'm going to start by subtracting 6 from both sides to isolate my x squared. And so draw your line down and write what's left behind so you know where your equal sign is. Well, 6 minus 6, that's 0, and I'm left with an x squared is equal to 106 minus 6, which is 100. And so now I can take the square root of x squared to get rid of the square and the square root of 100. And so I'm left with the square root of x squared is x, which is equal to the square root of 100, which is plus or minus 10. Don't forget the square root of 6 over here is plus or minus that. Okay, number 7 is the same thing. I have to isolate, so again, I'm going to draw my line. I'm going to divide both sides by 36. When I do 36 divided by 36, it cancels, and I'm left with v squared is equal to 9 over 36, which is the same thing as 1 over 4. Now, when I take the square root of a fraction, I have to take the square root of the top part and the square root of the bottom part. So the square root of the top part, the square root of 1 is 1, divided by the square root of the bottom part, which is 4, would be 2. Remember, it's plus or minus. Because if I square 1/2, both positive and negative, I will get positive 1/4. And 1/4 times 36 is 9. And the last one that we're going to do is number 9. In number 9, I have 64b squared minus 7. So at first, I have to add 7 to both sides. We'll do one more after this. Draw your line. 7 minus 7, that goes away. 57 plus 7, 64. And I have 64b squared left. Divide both sides by 64. The 64 is canceled, meaning I'm left with b squared, and 64 divided by 64 is equal to 1. Well, now I take the square root of both sides, so this is going to become the square root of b squared is equal to the square root of 1. And so b is going to equal plus or minus 1. Number 11, I have 4k squared minus 4 is equal to 96. Well, once again, I have to add 4 to both sides. And I have 4k squared, because these cancel, draw your line. 4k squared is equal to 100. Divide both sides by 4. The 4's go away, and I'm left with k squared is equal to 25. We'll take the square root of k, and that's going to be k squared and the square root of 25, and I'm left with k is equal to plus or minus 5. So as you see, you can kind of get the concept as we go through this, we keep getting, let's do number 13. If I subtract, so once again, I have to get x isolated. So if I subtract 10 from both sides, I'm left with 4x squared, because those canceled. 8 minus 10 is negative 2. And if I divide both sides by 4, the 4's go away or cancel, and I get x squared is equal to negative 1/2 or 2/4, as we see. And so again, I have to take the square root of both. So this is going to end up being the square root of x squared is equal to the square root of negative 1 over the square root of 2. Well, I can't do the square root of negative 1, so I know that this becomes I though, so x is going to equal x is going to equal the I divided by the square root of 2. Actually, let's do this. Instead of making this 1/2, we'll keep it simple, and we'll have negative 2/4, negative 2/4. And so the square root of negative 2 is actually going to become the square root of 2 times the square root of negative 1 all over the square root of 4, which is 2. And so x is going to equal the square root of 2i over 2. Okay, number 15, we got this big number over here. So we're going to add 7 to both sides to start. And when I do that, I get negative 6n squared because the 7's cancel. And then negative 582 when I add 7. And so then I'm going to divide both sides by negative 6. My negative 6's cancel each other out, and negative 582 divided by negative 6 leaves me with an n squared that's equal to a positive 97. And so then I make n squared to take the square root of both sides and square root of 97, and that's going to make n equal to plus or minus the square root of 97. And the last one, number 17, I add 8 to both sides to start, like we've been doing. Sorry, I moved the page up so you can see. And so my 8's cancel each other out, and I'm left with a positive 1 and 4n squared. I can divide both sides by 4. And I'm left with an n squared that's equal to 1/4. And so when I take n squared and do the square root, and that's equal to the square root of 1 divided by the square root of 4, which means that n is equal to 1 over 2, plus minus 1/2. Okay, so the big thing for the square rooting of these is to make sure that you have the plus minus in your final answer, but also to make sure that if your answer is negative, that you incorporate the I. Hopefully that will help you in solving the level 3A. If you have more questions, there are this video to help. Okay, feel free to Google anything in order to clarify. Hope this helps you with the level 3A, Unit 4B, level 3A. Thanks.